All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation on Black-footed Ferret conservation. My name is Samantha Gentry, and I'm an AmeriCorps member serving with Conservation Nebraska's Common Ground program. Conservation Nebraska's mission is to protect our state's natural legacy by educating the public, supporting communities, and increasing civic engagement, which we accomplish through locally led education efforts and community engagement projects to address local conservation concerns. Before today's speaker, there are a few housekeeping things to go over. Your cameras will remain off and you will be muted throughout the presentation. Type any questions you have into the chat or the Q&A section, and we will answer those at some point during or after the presentation. The presentation will be recorded and will be uploaded to Conservation Nebraska's YouTube page within the next couple of weeks. So if you miss any part of today's presentation or would like to revisit any part or share it with others, you will be able to find it there. Following the presentation, we will have a very brief survey that will take less than a minute to complete. The survey helps programming like this one, so we appreciate you taking the time to fill those out. If anyone in attendance is interested in speaking with a Conservation Nebraska member regarding conservation issues in Nebraska, or to find out more about what we do, please email info@neconserve.org. Today, we welcome Tina Jackson, who serves as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Black-footed Ferret Recovery Coordinator, a role she began in 2024. She brings more than 2 decades of experience from Colorado Parks and Wildlife, where she led conservation and recovery efforts for over 70 species, including black-footed ferrets, black-tailed prairie dogs, Prebles and New Mexico meadow jumping mice, bats, and a variety of reptiles. Tina has played a key leadership and collaborative roles on numerous state and national working groups and recovery teams, helping guide multi-agency efforts to protect and restore imperiled species across Colorado and the West. She holds a bachelor's degree in environmental population and organismic biology from the University of Colorado Boulder, and a master's degree in natural resource law and policy from the University Denver Sturm College of Law. Outside of work, Tina enjoys traveling, scuba diving, winemaking, handcrafts, and spending time with her husband and their dog. And with that, I will let her take it away.
Thank you so much, Samantha. Can you see my presentation? Is it up?
Yes, I can see it.
Yay, perfect. And I forgot the part about my bachelor's degree being from CU Boulder, talking to a group of Nebraskans. It's always hard because I was in that time where it was the big rivalry. So sorry, guys, but go Buffs. So yeah, happy to chat today about these fun little weasels. I really love working with ferrets, and yeah, always happy to share what's happening in the ferret world with others. And I've got Brooke Stansberry with our Nebraska field office with me today for any of those Nebraska specific questions. I'm good on the ferret side, but Brooke can help me out. And she brought one of her favorite animals with her too. And I have some co-hosts here, so if I need to show anything, I do have someone here to help me. So let's kick this off. Ferrets, super fun. So I always love to start this by just making sure everyone is as excited about ferrets as I am. And that's where showing them up close and personal really helps. This is a litter of kits that spent, I don't remember what year this was filmed, but this is out in our preconditioning pens, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. But this is a litter getting used to living out in the wild. They were born in captivity and just out during the daytime, which is unusual. We'll also talk about that, playing in the snow. But going to stop chatting for a minute because they're going to get a little up close and personal here quickly. Here it comes. So I always have some favorite things about different species that I've worked on. And one of my favorite things about ferrets are toe beans. Anyone who knows toe beans, ferrets have the most adorable little toe beans. So, okay, so a little bit about black-footed ferrets. We have fossil evidence of these guys back 10,000 years. They've been around for a while. First described scientifically by Audubon in 1851 in Wyoming. And they're really not very big. This guy that I brought with me today is about how big they get in real life. This would be a large male. 1.5, 2.5 pounds, 18 to 24 inches in length. They're very yellow buff. And what makes them different from some of the other ferrets you'd see out there is that very distinct black mask, cute little black feet, and the black tip on the tail. So the ferrets that we all know from pets, those are not black-footed ferret. Those are domestic ferrets from Europe. But we'll show some pictures and comparisons of those here quickly. They're sexually mature at 1 year. They live a fast life. And in the wild, they live 1 to 3 years. Here in captivity, we have had some reach 8 and 9, but they're usually not sexually active after about year 4. In the wild, we have about 1 male to every 2 females, and they are territorial. So there's only 1 female per territory, and those territories can be pretty large, 280 acres or more for a female, depending on the prairie dog species that they're living on. And then the males overlap that, and they have big acreages of about 320. So when we're doing a reintroduction or we're looking at a release site, we're usually starting at 1,500 acres. We really like sites that are 3,000, 5,000, upwards of 10,000 acres of prairie dogs. And they're primarily nocturnal. So these guys come out at night. Part of that is to keep from being eaten by all the raptors and coyotes and things out on the landscape. It's also a good time to go hunting for prairie dogs that are sleeping in their burrows. So there are 3 ferret species across the world. There's the domestic ferret, like we mentioned, the pet ferret that people have, that comes from Eurasia. There's the Siberian polecat, a little bit bigger than black-footed ferrets and a lot angrier. And then black-footed ferrets are the only ferret species native to North America. In difference of these guys from those domestic ferrets that people know of as pets, these guys are solitary. They do not want to live in groups. And they're also really quite angry. They're adorable, but they're really pretty ferocious. One of the things we say here in the program is if they were the size of German Shepherds, none of us would ever leave our homes. So they're part of the mustelid family. So here is some of their kind of cousins. Makes a lot of sense. We've got ermine and mink. But also badgers. I talk a lot about ferrets are a badger attitude in like a mink body size. And then wolverines, river otters. River otters, we all think of them as being very playful, and ferrets are very playful as well. So historically, ferrets are very dependent on prairie dogs. They live in their prairie dog burrows. They eat prairie dogs predominantly, more than 90% of their diet. So historically, we knew ferrets occurred in 3 of the 5 prairie dog species in North America, mostly in the black-tailed prairie dog, which is that big green blob on the map. And then we also have them from whitetails and Gunnison prairie dogs. The other 2 prairie dog species, the Utah prairie dog, which is federally listed as endangered, only occurs in Utah, and the Mexican prairie dog, only found in Mexico, and we do not believe it's still around. We don't have any records that ferrets occurred there. So when we're talking about putting ferrets back out in the wild, it's back into these sorts of habitats. We have done releases in most of the states. We're missing North Dakota, Nebraska, Texas, and Oklahoma. And we've also done releases as far north as Canada and Grasslands National Park and down in northern Mexico. So I think most people who know prairie dogs or who live in prairie dog range understand the importance of prairie dogs. They are a really amazing animal in and amongst themselves. They create a habitat type, and that's the way I kind of think about prairie dogs a lot of times. They're a species that we want to take care of and maintain, but they're also providing a habitat for all these other species. So they create these really unique underground burrow structures, and a lot of other species depend on that as a place to shelter from the prairie, because there's not a lot of places out there. And ferrets are one of those. Ferrets live in prairie dog burrows, but then also 90% of their diet is prairie dogs. And that's the other thing that prairie dogs provide on the prairie, is they are a great food source for anything bigger than them. We kind of joke that they're the chicken nugget of the prairie. Almost anything will eat it if they have the opportunity. So ferrets have kind of developed this unique lifestyle where what they're doing is they're living in prairie dog burrows and eating their landlords. So for anyone who's a renter out there, just maybe not recommend that idea. So why are we working on ferrets? Well, the issue is these guys are solitary, they're nocturnal, and they live in these large ranges. And so as prairie dogs started to decline across the central part of the US, so did ferrets. And so probably historically, there were 100 million acres of grasslands, and then they started to decline due to conversion to cropland, large-scale prairie dog poisonings that happened in the early 1900s, and then most importantly, the introduction of sylvatic plague. And for everyone that's ever heard of the Black Death that decimated Europe and the world population back in the Middle Ages, that is the same bacteria that we're still dealing with at this point. It's not native to North America, so a lot of our rodents and our small mammal species aren't evolved to deal with it. And so when that bacteria moved into North America, it started decimating some of these. And one of them that it hits very hard is our prairie dog species. So the thing we still deal with a lot when we're doing ferret reintroductions is plague management on those sites. Back in the 1970s, we did find, we thought the ferrets were gone, but then in the late 60s, early 70s, we found a population in Millette County, South Dakota. A whole bunch of researchers and scientists got together, captured up ferrets, tried to get them to breed in captivity, and were unable to do that. We learned a lot of important lessons in that. We learned about how we need to vaccinate them and what vaccines we can use for canine distemper and plague. We also learned a little bit on how we need to keep them in captivity and how we can get them to breed, but we lost them. We lost the ones in captivity, and that site was extirpated in 74. So that last animal in captivity died in 79, and at that point we thought ferrets were extinct again. And so, that's not really what conservation biologists want to hear. And so kind of kept looking. And then in 1981, and I'll show Shep's picture here in a moment because he's a lifesaver for all of us. There was a dog in Meeteetse, Wyoming, a ranch dog, who brought something home in the middle of the night. The rancher came out in the morning and saw it and said, well, I don't know what that is, and tossed it down the hill. And his wife looked at it and said, well, that's kind of cute. Why don't we get it mounted? Took it into the taxidermist, and the taxidermist in Meeteetse said, that's a black-footed ferret. We need to call the Fish and Wildlife Service in the state of Wyoming. So a population of ferrets was found in that site in Meeteetse, Wyoming. At the time it was found, there was probably about 120 or so animals. They started to decline from a disease outbreak. The very difficult decision was made to capture the last remaining animals up, and they brought 18 of them into captivity. Were able to actually get them to breed. And every ferret we have, every black-footed ferret we have in North America right now is descended from that population. We did some genetic work recently on the kind of structure of the population, and we figured out that it's actually descended from 7 founder lines. We do have the opportunity to bring in founder line 8 and founder line 9, and we'll talk about those in a little bit, but that's a pretty significant bottleneck that these guys went through. And it really reflects kind of the importance of the Great Plains. I mean, I grew up in South Dakota. I've lived in Colorado, the Eastern Plains of Colorado, for 20, 30 years now. Don't want to do the math. And the plains are super important. And I think one of the things I love about the plains, and I think anyone who lives in Nebraska can probably agree with me on this, is there's a beauty to the plains that is unparalleled. Here in Colorado, everyone raves about the mountains, and you go into the mountains and they kind of slap you in the face saying, I'm gorgeous, admire me. And you go out on the prairie and you have to kind of slow down and look at that beauty. And find it. And so there's been a lot of changes that have happened. You know, historically, we had these really large prairie dog colonies and bison herds that moved along. And now we've got prairie dog colonies that are a lot more isolated. And we've changed that grazer. So, you know, the ferrets and the other species that depend on those prairie dog habitats have had to adapt. So I mentioned we were going to show you Shep. This is the guy here over on the left-hand side of the slide, and that's John Hogg with him. And these are some of the early folks that were out there at that Matitsi site, and it's their work that means I have a job right now. That means we have ferrets in the world and are able to put them out in the landscape right now. So hugely important work that they did. So once we brought those ferrets into captivity, the next step was, could we get them to breed? And that was done a lot with the state of Wyoming. And then once that started taking off, it switched over to the Fish and Wildlife Service. And I currently sit at the National Black-footed Ferret Conservation Center in north central Colorado. We're between Fort Collins and Cheyenne, and 2/3 of the captive population sits right outside my window over here. We have a breeding building. This is the time of year where we kick off breeding. I mentioned that males and females are solitary. They both have to come into receptivity and be ready to breed. And once we start seeing that in the captive population, we'll introduce a male into a female's cage, leave them together for about 3 days. And then, as long as they're not at each other's throats, and then separate them. And about 40 days later, we end up with a tiny litter of ferrets. They're born with their eyes closed, their ears closed. They really can't even walk. They're about the size of your pinky. And part of that is because mom needs to be hunting in prairie dog burrows. Mom needs to be doing a lot of things while she's pregnant. So when we have a female that may be pregnant over there in the breeding facility, we actually can't tell in a lot of cases. And we have some females who hang out with the male and they get their extra rations for 40 days. And then at the end, we don't end up with any baby ferrets. They kind of pulled one over on us. But baby ferrets are called kits. The other thing, just to toss out here a little side note, male ferrets are called hobs. Females are called, it just poofed out of my head. And this is a tough one. And I know that you all can't chime in, but I'm going to ask Brooke and Samantha if they know what a group of ferrets is. It's a tough one. We've all heard of a herd of elk and a murder of crows and a parliament of owls, and it's right up there with those. This right here is a business of ferrets. A group of ferrets is a business. So this is what they look like when they're born, tiny pink little things. They stay underground in the burrow or in the captive facility. They stay in their underground area for 30 days. But then by about 30, 35 days, they're starting to eat actual meat. By 45 days, they can make their first kill. And by 60 to 90 days, they're actually leaving mom. So they grow really fast, but they're super cute as babies. One of the things I really love about newborn ferrets is they look like they have a little mullet. They have longer hair on the back of their head. So last year was a remarkable year for us. We have about 300 ferrets in captivity, 2/3 of that here at the National Black-footed Ferret Conservation Center. We have 5 zoo partners that hold the other third of them. Here at the center, we had 62 litters, which was a record, best year since 2009, 273 kits born. That doubled our population here at the center. And across the program, we had 500 ferrets born. So it was a really good year for us. And we were putting more ferrets out in the wild than we had in a number of years. Once those kits reach that 60-year-old age, they get to leave the breeding facility and move out into our preconditioning pens. We talk about this as ferret boot camp. This is where they learn how to be a ferret. They learn how to live in those prairie dog colonies, We actually give them live prairie dogs once a week to learn to hunt. Mom is usually out there with them for the first month, and they live together in their little sibling groups. It's a great time to go out and see them. If I'm having a rough day with meetings, I'll pop out there and kind of watch the ferrets play for a bit because they're super playful. But the other thing that we've done here is we've protected them from predators, but we do also sit in the middle of a prairie dog colony so they can hear all the sights and sounds that are going to happen when they get released into the wild. This is another video from our pens. A group of ferrets, litter out there learning how to get around and use the burrow for shelter. As you can see, just super curious animals. We put a camera out there. These are usually like GoPros or trail cameras, and they want to see what it is. They want to know what's going on, but then they've also got that little bit of fear to go back down into the burrow and protect themselves. One of the hardest things we have here at the breeding facility is when people come see these guys. They're so cute and they're so curious. Everyone wants to pet them because they look so soft, and they are super soft. But if they're awake, petting is a bad idea. So we have been doing reintroductions. We started those back in the 90s. And so far we've released into 35 different sites across the West. We did have a release in Canada and a release in Mexico, but the other 33 have been in the US. This represents all the places we've ever put ferrets, but actually at this point, less than 20 of those sites are still active. Plague comes into some of the sites and we lose them. But we do have a number of sites that are hanging on. For years, these numbers 2 and 4 were one of our best sites, Kanata Basin Badlands in South Dakota, but we had a plague outbreak come in and then drought hit them last year, kind of back-to-back whammies, and that population has seen a bit of a decline, but we're holding our breath that they might rebound. We typically say we have about 500 animals in the wild, but because of that decline at Kanata Basin, we're probably looking more like 300 wild animals in the wild. So from that original 18 that was brought into captivity, we have about 300 into captivity at this point and about 300 in the wild. So numbers still aren't great, but hanging on. We do a lot of work with tribes across the range. These are the tribal sites that we've released in to, and whenever we're doing a release, we like to get the local community out to help with that. And so we've had a lot of tribal partners, a lot of tribal community members come out on releases. And yeah, it's always a fun day when we're out there releasing ferrets. So you can see here in this, we take them out in these cat carriers, open that up, and they usually dive into the burrow. We give them a little piece of hamster or prairie dog as a going away present, and often they'll come back up and do a little walkabout for us. So I mentioned we might have a founder 8 and a founder 9 coming in. So back in 2020, there were a few things happening that year, but one of the things I remember most is in December of 2020, this little diva up here was born. So back in the 80s, we had a female that was brought in from that original 18. She was named Willa, and she passed away without her genetics being carried into the population that we have today. But one thing that did happen is we grabbed a sample of her skin and sent it to the frozen zoo at the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance. And so as cloning work was moving on, we were contacted by a couple of different partners who said, we think we're at a point where we might be able to clone some of those samples from the frozen zoo for ferrets. And so using domestic ferrets as the egg source and as the surrogates, we were able to clone Willa's genetics into Elizabeth Ann. She was born in December of 2020. 2020. Unfortunately, we found out the first year that we tried to breed Elizabeth Ann that she had a uterine deformity and was unable to breed. So she was amazing. It was a great proof of concept. Scientifically, it was spectacular, but she wasn't going to be able to bring those genetics in. So then in the spring of 2023, Noreen and Antonia were born. Antonia was born at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, the Smithsonian Zoo, and Noreen was born here at the Ferret Center. And they both have successfully bred. In spring of 24, Antonia gave birth to Seabird and Red Cloud. That's these two kids here. And then last spring, Noreen gave birth to Qatari, a little female. And so currently in the clone line, in Willa's line, we have 11 individuals, but we are still looking at these animals to make sure that there's no genetic concerns on bringing them into our captive population. We're going to do some trials with them out in the pens and just see how things are going before we introduce this line. The ninth line that we might be able to bring in was a male that died back in the 80s of canine distemper. That line is proving a little bit more difficult to get through the cloning process, but our partners are still continuing to work on it. So these guys have all been great. The one sad news we had from 2025 is Elizabeth Ann passed away. She was 5.5, I believe, at the time. And then we actually lost Noreen when she was giving birth to Qatari. So the only actual clone left is Antonia, and she's housed at the Smithsonian out in Front Royal, Virginia. Plague continues to be our biggest challenge. Plague, the biggest issue is it impacts the prairie dog population. It's spread by fleas. So the prairie dogs aren't the problem. It's the fleas that are the problem. And as I mentioned, it's what caused the issue back in the Middle Ages. This program runs because of all the partnerships. We have a bunch of federal agencies, a bunch of state agencies, tribes, the governments of Canada and Mexico we work with, a ton of NGOs, and then our captive breeding facilities. A lot of those release sites have also happened on private lands. So we have a number of private landowners that have participated in the program, and we greatly appreciate their partnership. Because these guys are so hard to see out on the landscape, it's not something that you can just pop out and see a ferret running around. We do a lot of outreach, and there are a number of outreach facilities across the country. We don't have any in Nebraska, but if you ever pop over into Colorado, here in Fort Collins, we have the Fort Collins Museum of Discovery. And then in Denver, we've got the Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge has ferrets on display, and the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo has ferrets on display. So please pop in and see these guys up close and personal. Some of the other things we've done, Frontier put a ferret on one of their tails. The plane, that ferret is called Wellington, after the town that's really close to us. And that plane, every now and then when I'm at Denver International Airport, I'm checking tails to see if Wellington's in Denver. But there's a lot of great outreach that goes on. There's amazing videos out there. For those of us old enough to remember Mutual of Omaha Wild Kingdom, they rebooted that, and they did a great episode on the ferret cloning work and how it's impacting some of the other species out there. These are some of the examples of the live ferret displays that we have around the country. Lots of different ways that partners have set this up. One of the newest ones and one of the most remarkable is at the American Prairie Visitor Center in Lewiston, Montana. And if you're ever up that way, please pop in and take a look. And then lastly, one of the things that happened here at Fort Collins Museum of Discovery is we've got ferrets there on exhibit, and they brought in some artists from Mexico to develop an alebrije. And they got to meet the ferrets that we had there at the time. It was Dude and Churro. And they were so smitten that the alebrije has black feet, really long teeth, and green glowing eyes. When we're doing spotlight surveys, the spotlights make the ferret's eyes glow green. So they based a lot of the features on the ferrets. A quick overview. I mentioned the cloning, that we had 10 kits produced in the clone line. We had our best breeding season. we have about 93% kit survival when they're out in the pens. And the one number that my staff brought up, and I went, wait a second, we used 147 preconditioning pens last year. And the reason I went, wait a second, is we have 72. So we, at some point last fall, we were using each of our pens twice. And there was a point where we did the math and we had over 500 animals on site because of preconditioning, animals coming in from the other breeding facilities. It was a pretty remarkable fall for us. We released into 14 sites last year. We put 265 kits out on the landscape. And then we held 19 kits over. There's a site down in Arizona where the prairie dogs hibernate, and we thought we'd try a spring release at that site. So just a quick picture of some of the other species that are out there depending on those prairie dog colonies. You know, it takes a lot of work to protect the ferrets, and when we're doing that, all these other species are benefiting from it as well. And I believe that's it. I talked super fast. So what questions do we have?
Okay, so before we get into questions, I'm going to launch the survey. If everyone could fill that out, that would be great. Okay. And so a few questions. Okay, so you mentioned, let me pull up the chat. You mentioned that their main diet is prairie dogs. So how much bigger are the ferrets to the prairie dogs?
They are actually about the same size. So that's part of the reason that I really respect the predation that ferrets do. They are out there hunting something the same size as them. In the spring, when the females are pregnant and when they're raising their litter of kids, they're actually depending on the prairie dog pups that are born. So when we have drought come in or we have an issue with prairie dog production, we may see an issue with our ferret reproduction numbers, because that mom is going to rely on those young kind of stupid prairie dogs to hunt during that time when she needs to be eating a lot more. But yeah, a ferret is about the same size as a prairie dog. A ferret will probably kill a prairie dog about every 3 days, and they eat everything. They eat the fur, they eat the bones. There's not much left to that prairie dog after they're done. And a lot of times we're guessing that the reason they're hunting again in 3 days is probably more for the moisture, because those prairie dog kills are where they get their moisture as well. So.
Wow. And then another question. So how old do they get? How long do they live? Like either in captivity or in the wild?
In the wild, average lifespan is a year. So we lose a lot of animals from the litters as they're dispersing, but they can live up to about 4 or 5 years. We've had a few that have been tagged that we know have lived longer than that. In captivity, we've seen them live 8, maybe 9 years. By that point, they're definitely getting to be the creaky old ferret, and they're getting a lot of medical attention. And we've got a lot of great folks taking care of them at that point. But yeah, in the wild, they're usually living to about 4.
Okay. Um, and then is the conservation center open to the public?
Not really. We do every now and then do tours. Once we get into breeding season, we shut down because we want to keep the environment as conducive to breeding and raising young as possible. We will do tours at times though, and if anyone has a group that's interested, they can just reach out and we can work with them on that. But yeah, we are not open to the public. But that's why those outreach facilities, any place that has those animals on exhibit, like I mentioned, the Fort Collins Museum of Discovery, the Rocky Mountain Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge, our zoo partners, they've all got animals that you can go see and see them interact. Yeah.
Okay, and then okay, it says why haven't ferrets been introduced in Nebraska? And that might be a
So
question for Brooke or Mark. I don't know.
Yeah, so I can start by saying, when we do a release, when we do a reintroduction, we're working with willing landowners and willing partners. We work a lot with the different state agencies and government land management agencies and things like that. And Nebraska just isn't a spot that's come up yet, but I don't know if Brooke or Mark wanna mention more about that.
I'll jump in. I know that we've primarily have to have the right amount of space for them, number one, and the prairie dogs. We have struggled to have that, and there's a management plan that's to manage prairie dogs as well. That's for the state, and willing landowners. I mean, so like Tina said, I mean, we haven't had quite that support yet to make that all happen, and we really have to have the space. I mean, number one, so we just don't have the acres.
Yeah, that's the challenge we deal with across the range is just having the appropriate acres in a way that also balances what the land management agencies or the landowners are wanting to do with those acres as well. A
Right.
lot of the sites that we release on do have active ranching, so there are cattle or bison herds that move across those landscapes, but it's they prairie dogs don't do well with any crop acreages. It's just, yeah, it's finding the right spots for them.
Right, the contiguous size, and I think also most of the prairie dog areas we've had have been hit with plague pretty severely. So like, that's the last I knew is that we've had severe plague outbreaks as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
And so, can you remind me, so how much space is needed for one of the, like for a release?
So in blacktail prairie dogs, which is
yeah,
most of the range, they're a denser prairie dog species. And so we typically start at about 1,500 acres, but we're actually finding that 1,500 may be on the small side, especially with the combination of plague and drought that we've been seeing recently. So that's 1,500 acres of prairie dogs, which usually means that you're looking at more acreage of those kind of blank spaces between the prairie dog colonies. So yeah, but some of our sites are up in the 10, 20, 30,000 acres of prairie dogs.
Okay, and then speaking of the plague, someone said, how is the sylvatic plague being controlled?
Ah,
yeah,
that's a great question. So, kind of the tried and true gold standard that we use is a insecticidal dust. So, as I said, plague is transmitted by fleas. So, anytime we can control fleas, that'll help control plague. So. Historically, what we would do is we'd go out and do delta dust application at every prairie dog burrow in the landscape. So just some quick back of the envelope numbers. Typically in blacktail prairie dogs, you think of an average of 30 to 35 prairie dog burrows per acre, 1,500 acres and up. And so that's a lot of plague dusting that we have to do. We go through a lot of dust. We spend a lot of time on ATVs with wands and prairie dog burrows because you have to hit them all. More recently, we've been looking at some other things. There's some researchers with USGS and Colorado Parks and Wildlife that have developed a vaccine. It's a little bait pellet, peanut butter flavored that we put out on the landscape, and the prairie dogs have one of them too. They go out and eat that, and it vaccinates the prairie dogs against plague. It's reasonably effective, and it helps keep the prairie dogs on the landscape, but it really isn't helping to the point that the ferrets can survive a plague outbreak on that site. We've also had some researchers recently looking into a chemical called fipronil. This is similar to the sort of flea application you'd do on a pet, that little drip stuff on the back of the neck. A lot of times that has fipronil in it. And so there's fipronil treated grain that we can go put out at the prairie dog burrows. And then they've also taken that drug and put it into that same bait sort of structure and put that out there. We call those fit bits, and those fit bits are pretty promising. Most of that dusting, plague vaccine, and fipronil grain, we estimate costs us about $30 an acre. Again, thinking of those large acreages we have, that starts to get pretty expensive. But those Fitbits, it may get it down to about $5 an acre to be able to put them out there. That's just an estimate at this point. And all of those really need to be done every year. Part of that is the dust and the fipronil probably only lasts about a year. But prairie dogs, because they're those chicken nuggets of the prairie, we get a lot of turnover of that population. So even if we vaccinate prairie dogs every year, we have about 50% of the population has turned over that next year. So we need to vaccinate them again. So yeah, it's a difficult process, and we're looking at lots of different tools and techniques to improve that, because it's really the big nut we got to crack to get these guys recovered.
Okay, and then I just want to mention the survey one more time. If everyone can fill that out, that would be great. And then this is kind of a follow-up question to that. So it says Northwest Iowa's Five Ridge Prairie is about 1,000 acres. Is there any chance of introducing enough prairie dogs there to support the ferret?
1,000 acres is definitely on the small side. So we have a number of sites, especially here in Colorado and some other places, where it's different landowners that kind of come together. So you have one that has a lot, and then you have some neighbors that maybe have a little bit. Yeah, it's on the small side, but we also look at, some of the ideas of when can we use smaller sites, maybe as a place where we can raise ferrets for release somewhere else, or to do some research work. But yeah, I don't know that site in particular. I don't know if Brooke or Mark have any thoughts on that site.
I don't know, and I don't know what Iowa's requirements are, as far as doing both prairie dog introduction as well. It's probably a state managed species, but I don't know. Yeah, I'm not familiar with the site at all.
And then this question might be again for Brooke again. What is Nebraska doing for black-footed ferret conservation?
I think primarily supporting, our state counterparts in shortgrass prairie, conservation, so that suite of species, the swift fox is a state listed species. And then when we do have prairie dogs, we try to make sure if projects, I have worked a lot with transportation. So if they're going to go through an area that has had, our large colonies of prairie dogs, we try to work with them to avoid going straight through it. And like one of our projects we had them pull back as far as they could. I think they ended up not doing the project at all, so they weren't impacting it. They actually were maintaining the east-west route, I think up in like around the Alliance area. But primarily, yeah, we haven't had any since I think it was, I was reading this morning because it seemed like it's been a long time. Since 1949, they have not been in Nebraska. Maybe you said that too. I don't remember, Tina. I know that we've had reportings over the years, but the last one was a mortality that was found that was from a South Dakota population in 2013, I believe. So we haven't had any that we've, any luck with the habitat requirements of what they need. And primarily that prairie dog source is a really big thing, because they really need to have food. But focusing on the shortgrass prairie ecosystem has probably been our best efforts, and the migratory birds as well, like burrowing owls. So anywhere we can try to increase supporting the state, and any willing landowner or a group that's willing to work with us on helping conserve shortgrass prairies.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big pieces is, shortgrass prairie, and prairie in particular, is one of those things that a lot of the public just doesn't think about protecting. And I was listening to something recently, and they were talking about, when we want to talk about the prairie, we talk about the American Serengeti. And it's like, why can't we think about this amazing habitat type that we have here in North America? And why isn't that something that our public just doesn't connect with as well? The prairie is just such an amazing place, and all the species that use it, and it's yeah.
And like a state like Kansas, we're 97% private in Nebraska too, so we have very small amounts of federal land. So that's one of the things I didn't mention as far as the like where Tina is. There's a lot of federal land partners as well that can actually do things on their properties that are of the right size, and we just don't have that in Nebraska. So.
Yep.
And so I guess if someone comes across one, where do they go to report it, or who do they tell?
Yeah, if someone thinks they see a ferret, the first thing I always say is try to get a photo. Any photo can help us identify. There are some weasel species out there that they're easily confused with. So a photo and a good location of where you saw it. I always recommend, you're always welcome to call us at the Ferret Center, reach out to us, but local partners are going to be able to get to it quicker. The Nebraska field office or the state of Nebraska, the wildlife department is a great way to make that contact. And yeah, we'll try to follow up on it if it looks like something that's definitely. I actually didn't hear about that, probably because it was before my time. That
Yeah.
ferret that came down from South Dakota, so that's interesting to hear, because they will, especially in the fall. The males in particular take off walking, and they just keep wandering until they find another ferret. And if they head the wrong direction, they'll end up
Yeah.
in spots that don't work so well.
Yeah, it got us all pretty excited. I remember because I was around then, and yeah, just it was from the South Dakota population, and then nothing else since. I do know, like our office did get called, a number of times, and just yeah, nothing was verified ever. So, but yeah, but that's yeah, typically they've gotten in touch with Game and Parks or with our office for reporting, and yeah, try to do what we can.
Yeah.
All right.
I think if we have.
Well, if we don't have any more questions, that concludes our webinar. If you haven't gotten a chance to fill out the survey that was launched, I will reiterate how we would greatly appreciate it if you took the time to fill it out. If you want to share this with someone who wasn't able to attend, or if you want to watch it again, this webinar will be posted on our YouTube channel in the near future with all of our past webinars. Thank you so much for attending the webinar and for supporting local conservation efforts. Most importantly, thank you, Tina and Brooke, for this presentation and for sharing your time and talent. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much.